The morning Roscoe Hartwell found a woman standing at his locked front gate, rifle across her back and dust on her boots, was the morning the most feared rancher in 3 counties forgot every single reason he had ever given himself to stay alone. Nobody walked up to the Hartwell gate uninvited. Not the sheriff from Caldwell. Not the cattle brokers from Wichita. Not the Methodist preacher who had once ridden 3 days just to collect a debt Roscoe owed the church building fund, and who had turned his horse around without knocking when he saw the sign Roscoe had nailed to the post. The sign read simply, "Turn back." It was not a suggestion. Everyone in Sumner County, Kansas, in the year of our Lord 1883, understood that Roscoe Hartwell meant what he said and said very little else. He was 41 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone shelf the Cimarron River carved through down south. His hair had gone iron gray at the temples sometime around the year his wife Clara died of fever, and the rest of him had gone iron too, or so the stories said. He ran 4,000 acres of short-grass prairie, 300 head of longhorn cattle, and a crew of 8 cowboys who were loyal mostly because he paid them fairly, and partially because none of them wanted to find out what disloyal looked like on this particular ranch. He had not fired a single shot at a man in 6 years, but the reputation held anyway, the way a storm cloud holds its shape even after the rain is spent. Ellen Whitaker was 28 years old, and she had not come to Sumner County to be frightened of anyone. She had come because she had a map, a letter, and a land deed that said the 40 acres bordering the southeast corner of the Hartwell property belonged to her, left to her by her late uncle, Vernon Whitaker, who had homesteaded it in 1879 and died of a rattlesnake bite the previous autumn without a soul knowing. He had a niece in Missouri, until the county land office wrote to track down the next of kin. She had sold nearly everything she owned in Springfield to make the journey. She had ridden the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway to Wellington, Kansas, hired a wagon from a livery man named Dobbins who had warned her 3 separate times during the drive out that she was heading toward Hartwell land, and that people did not do that. She had thanked him politely each time and asked him to please keep driving. She stood at the gate with her carpet bag at her feet and her uncle's old Winchester rifle slung across her back, not because she intended to use it, but because a woman traveling alone in 1883 did not leave a firearm in a wagon. She had a letter from the Sumner County Land Office in her coat pocket. She had a deed with a proper stamp on it. She had, in the estimation of every person who had met her over the last 4 days, a considerable amount of nerve. She did not knock on the gate because there was nothing to knock on. She opened the latch because the latch was simply a latch and not a lock, and she walked through. Roscoe was coming back from the eastern pasture on his sorrel gelding, Pepper, when he saw the small dark figure moving along the fence line toward the house. He pulled Pepper up and stared. He thought for a moment it might be one of his hands, but none of his hands walked like that, with that particular straight-backed, deliberate stride that suggested whoever it was had somewhere specific to be and intended to arrive. He put Pepper into a canter. He pulled up 20 yards from her, and she stopped walking and looked up at him, shading her eyes with her hand even though the October sun was behind her, and she did not need to shade anything. He decided later that it was simply a habit she had, looking at things directly, even the things that were large and on horseback and bearing down on her. "You are on private property," he said. His voice was the voice that made his hands look at their boots. It did not make her look at her boots. "I am aware," she said. "My name is Ellen Whitaker. My uncle was Vernon Whitaker. He owned the 40 acres east of your southeast fence line, and he left it to me, and I need to cross your property to reach it because your fence runs the full length of the road easement, and the county land office tells me there is a disputed access issue that has not been resolved." He stared at her for a long moment. The wind moved across the grass and Pepper shifted his weight. "Vernon Whitaker is dead," he said. "I know that," she said. "I am his heir. I don't know you. You don't need to know me." You need to let me through to my land." He had not, in recent memory, been told by anyone what he needed to do. The sensation was unusual enough that he sat very still on Pepper and studied her face, which was sun-browned and serious and framed by dark hair that had come partially loose from its pins after what was clearly a long and difficult journey. She had brown eyes that did not waver. She had a smear of red Kansas dust across her left cheekbone. She had, he noticed with the completely unwilling attention of a man who has been alone for a long time, a mouth that was set in determination but was not, underneath that determination, unkind. "Where is your proof?" he said finally. She reached into her coat pocket and produced the folded letter from the land office and the deed. She held them up. He did not dismount. She walked forward 3 steps and extended them toward him, and he leaned down from the saddle and took them and read them both slowly, while Pepper stood patient beneath him. They were exactly what she had said they were. He folded them and handed them back. He looked at the carpet bag sitting in the grass where she had set it when she reached for the papers. "Where are you planning to sleep?" he said. "On my land," she said. "Your land has a sod house on it that has not been occupied in 11 months, he said. "It will have snakes." "I have dealt with snakes before," she said. He looked at her for another long moment. The October light was getting lower and golden behind him, and it made the prairie glow like hammered copper. He thought about Vernon Whitaker, whom he had known slightly and disliked mildly for the 3 years the man had been his neighbor, but who had caused him no serious trouble, and who had, in fact, once helped recover a stray calf from the creek without being asked. "I will have my man Deke ride out and check the sod house before you go in," he said. "Snakes are not something to manage alone." She looked surprised for the first time, just briefly, and then the surprise was gone. "I would appreciate that," she said. "You can wait at the main house," he said. He did not know why he said it. He watched the words leave his mouth with a sense of detached bewilderment, as if someone else had spoken them using his voice. She picked up her carpet bag. "Thank you," she said. He turned Pepper and rode ahead of her toward the house, and she walked behind, and that was how it began. The Hartwell main house was a 2-story frame structure that Roscoe had built in 1877, with milled lumber hauled up from Caldwell, which made it something of an anomaly on the southern Kansas plains, where most men were still living in dugouts or sod structures. Clara had wanted a proper house, and he had built her one, and when she died in 1880, he had not changed a single thing inside it except to stop winding the clock on the mantel, which had bothered Clara's sister when she visited the following year, and bothered him not at all. The house had a wide front porch with 2 chairs that no one ever sat in. It had a kitchen that smelled of coffee and dried sage, and the particular dusty warmth of a wood stove that was kept burning from September through April. It had a parlor where Clara's blue curtains still hung, and a dining table that seated 8, and was never used for more than 3. His housekeeper, Mabel Johansson, was a Swedish woman of 55 who had come to Kansas with her husband in the early years and stayed after he died of a farming accident, and who had been managing the Hartwell household for 6 years with an efficiency that Roscoe had come to rely on so completely that he sometimes forgot she was there until she was not. She was standing at the kitchen doorway when he came in with Ellen Whitaker behind him, and she looked at the woman and then at Roscoe and then at the woman again, and the expression on her face was one that Roscoe chose not to interpret. "This is Miss Whitaker," he said. "She is Vernon Whitaker's niece. She will be staying while Deke checks the sod house on the Whitaker 40. "Of course," Mabel said, and she smiled at Ellen in a way that suggested she was genuinely pleased to see another woman inside the house, which she probably was. Since the last time a woman had been a guest at the Hartwell Ranch, it had been a cattle buyer's wife from Wichita who had spent the entire visit looking at the curtains with an expression of mild horror, and had offered to replace them at her husband's expense. Ellen set her carpet bag down and looked around the kitchen. "Thank you for having me," she said, and she said it to Mabel as much as to Roscoe, which Mabel noticed. Roscoe went to find Deke. Deke Calloway was Roscoe's oldest hand, a lean, weathered Texan of 50 who had been working cattle since before the war and who had followed Roscoe up from the Indian Territory in '79, when Roscoe bought the Sumner County land. He had a soft spot for stray animals, an encyclopedic knowledge of local weather patterns, and absolutely no patience for fools, which made him very much at home on the Hartwell Ranch, where foolishness was treated as a form of personal failing. Roscoe found him in the barn replacing a broken cinch. "I need you to go check the Whitaker sod house," Roscoe said. "Vernon's niece has come out from Missouri to claim the 40. Deke looked up slowly. "Vernon's niece. That is what I said. A woman?" "Yes, Deke, a woman." Deke set down the cinch. He looked at Roscoe with the particular expression he reserved for situations he found interesting but was too wise to comment on directly. "I'll take Pete with me," he said. "2 sets of eyes for snakes is better." "Thank you," Roscoe said. He went back to the house and found Ellen Whitaker sitting at the kitchen table with her coat off and her sleeves rolled to the elbows, helping Mabel peel potatoes. And Mabel was talking, and Ellen was listening and laughing at something. And the sound of it moved through the kitchen like something Roscoe had not heard in that house in a very long time. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary, then walked through to his office and closed the door. He sat at his desk and looked at the land map pinned to the wall. The Whitaker 40 was there in the southeast corner, a small rectangle against his vast acreage. He had known the land was sitting empty. He had known eventually someone would come for it. He had not, in any version of events he had imagined, pictured someone like Ellen Whitaker coming for it. He had pictured some distant male relative, perhaps, someone soft and citified who would last one winter and sell out to him cheap. He had been waiting for that. He had been patient about it in the way he was patient about most things, which was to say he had decided what the outcome would be, and then he had simply waited for the world to cooperate. The world, it appeared, had other plans. He heard her laugh again through the closed door, and he opened the land ledger on his desk and stared at columns of numbers until the sound stopped distracting him. It took a while. Deke came back at dusk. Roscoe was on the front porch when the 2 riders came up the lane and he walked out to meet them. 3 rattlesnakes, Deke said, without greeting. One of them was big enough to be a problem. We got them all out. The roof looks sound. The door needs a new hinge. There is a crack in the east wall that wants chinked before the real cold comes. The well is good, water is clean. Overall, it is livable. "Did you clear the bedding?" Roscoe said. "Burn the whole lot of it," Deke said. "Miss, if she is truly going out there, is going to need fresh blankets and a mattress tick stuffed new." Roscoe nodded. He was already thinking. The October nights in southern Kansas were not brutal yet, but they would turn cold within the week. A sod house with no fire, no proper bedding, no food laid in. For a woman alone who had just arrived from Missouri and did not know the land, "She will stay here tonight," he said. Deke looked at him. Pete, who was 22 and knew enough to the ranch that he still occasionally expressed his opinions out loud, started to say something and then reconsidered it when he caught Deke's eye. "Yes, sir," Deke said. Roscoe went back inside and told Ellen what Deke had found. She listened without interrupting, which he was beginning to understand was characteristic of her. She processed things in silence before she spoke, and when she spoke she was precise. "A new hinge and chinked walls I can manage," she said. "I was a carpenter's daughter before I was anything else. But I will accept the offer of tonight's room if it is genuinely offered and not offered to be polite." "I don't say things to be polite," he said. "No," she agreed. "I gathered that." There was a beat of silence between them. Mabel was at the stove making noise with the pot lids and not looking at either of them, which Roscoe noticed and which meant she was paying very close attention to everything. "Dinner is at 6, he said. "After that I will show you which room is yours." He went back to his office. He did not get any more work done that evening. They ate at the big dining table, the 3 of them, which was the first time that table had felt adequately occupied in years. Roscoe said very little. He was aware of how little he said, which was itself unusual because he generally said little without being aware of it at all. Ellen talked with Mabel about the journey from Missouri, about the rail line, about Wellington, about the price of flour at the general store in town, about the particular red color of the Kansas soil that was unlike anything she had seen in Missouri. She asked Mabel questions about the prairie, and Mabel answered them fully, the way she answered things when she was enjoying herself. At one point, Ellen turned to Roscoe and said, "How long have you been on this land?" "Since '77, he said. "And before that?" "Texas," he said. "Indian Territory before that." "You drove cattle up." "I did." "Hard country," she said. "Yes," he said. She did not seem frustrated by his brevity. She moved on to the next question as easily as she had moved through his gate, which was to say, without hesitating and without making a particular point of it. "What does a woman need to know about a Kansas winter who has never spent one here?" she said. He looked at her directly for the first time across the table. In the lamplight, she looked less like someone who had just completed a long and difficult journey and more like someone who had always been here, at this table, in this light, asking exactly this question. "Fuel first," he said. "Cut and stack wood before November. Dried buffalo chips if wood runs short. Water second. Keep a barrel inside so your supply doesn't freeze. Food third. Stock your larder before the first hard freeze or you won't be able to get to town for weeks at a time. And never go out in a blizzard without a guide rope from the house to the barn, because people die every winter in this state by losing their way between the two buildings." She was listening very carefully. He found himself saying more than he intended. "Your uncle's property has a wood lot along the creek," he continued. "3 or 4 good cottonwoods, that should help. I can have Deke show you the woodpile he left." "Thank you," she said. "That is very practical advice." "I am a practical man," he said. "I am beginning to see that," she said, and something in her voice was warm, not teasing, but genuinely warm, the way someone speaks when they mean what they are saying. He looked back at his plate. After dinner, she helped Mabel clear the table without being asked, and Mabel accepted the help without protest, and the two of them moved around the kitchen together as if they had been doing it for years. Roscoe stood in the doorway of the parlor with a cup of coffee, and watched this, with the sensation of a man watching something through a window that he had not looked through in a very long time. He showed her the spare room at the end of the upstairs hall. It had been Clara's sewing room, converted to a guest room by Mabel at some point in the last 3 years, with a brass bed and a good wool blanket and a washstand with a blue pitcher. He was always slightly surprised to see it, having not planned for guests but being prepared for them anyway, which was Mabel's doing. "This is very comfortable," Ellen said, standing in the doorway with the lamp. "Good night, Miss Whitaker," he said. "Good night, Mr. Hartwell," she said. He went to bed and stared at the ceiling for an hour, which was also unusual. The next morning she was up before him, which nobody was. He came down to the kitchen at 5:30 and found her at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that she had made herself and a piece of paper on which she was making a list. She looked up when he came in. "I hope you do not mind," she said. "I could not sleep and I found the coffee things." "I don't mind," he said, which was true. He poured himself a cup and sat down at the other end of the table and looked at her list, which was upside down from where he sat but which appeared to be quite long. "What are you working out?" he said. "Everything I need before I can live on the 40 comfortably," she said. "Bedding, door hinge, chinking compound, food stores, firewood arrangement. A question about the well pump because your man said it was good, but I want to make sure I know how to manage it in freezing weather. You prime a pump in winter with warm water," he said. "Keep a kettle near the door for it." "Good to know," she said, and wrote it down. He watched her write. Her handwriting was clear and even. Her hands were not soft hands, he noticed. They were the hands of someone accustomed to work, with calluses on the right palm from what looked like tool use, not just needle and thread. "You said your father was a carpenter," he said. She looked up. "He was. He died when I was 16. I worked in his shop until I was old enough to take a teaching position." She paused. "I taught school in Springfield for 8 years. "And you gave that up to come here," he said. It was not quite a question. "I gave it up to come here," she confirmed. 40 acres of Kansas prairie and a sod house with snakes in it seemed like a better prospect. "Better than what?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her list. "Better than spending the rest of my life in a schoolroom in a town where I already knew exactly how every day was going to go," she said. "I am not very good at staying still in a life that has stopped moving." He thought about that. He thought about the fact that he had been in one place for 6 years in a life that had stopped moving the day Clara died, and that he had told himself this was exactly what he wanted. "The 40 acres is not much to build on," he said. "No," she said, "but it is mine." The word mine sat between them on the table with a certain weight to it, the weight of someone who has not had many things that were purely their own and who values that quality specifically. He drank his coffee. Deke rode her out to the Whitaker 40 after breakfast, and Roscoe did not go, which was the right decision. He had a ranch to run. He had cattle to move before the weather turned and a water tank on the north pasture that wanted inspection and 2 new horses that needed to be worked. He had things to do that had nothing to do with the woman on the 40 acres to the southeast. He was at the north tank by 8 o'clock. He was back at the southeast fence line by 9:30. He told himself he was checking the fence, which needed checking. The fence did need checking. This was true. He rode the line slowly and found 2 posts that needed resetting and a section of wire that had gone slack, and he noted them in his head for the hands to address, and he was thorough about it. And he was thorough about it for approximately 40 minutes before he heard the sound of hammering. He pulled Pepper up and listened. It was coming from the direction of the sod house, which was just visible from the fence line, a low brown shape against the golden grass with a thread of smoke rising from the chimney. Someone had gotten a fire going. The hammering continued, regular and confident. He rode along the fence to the point where there was a gap the cattle used to access the creek, and he went through it and rode to the sod house. She was on her knees at the front door with a chisel and a small hammer, working the hinge pin out of the old hinge plate. She had her hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, and she was wearing a canvas work apron over her dress, and she was doing the work correctly, he noted, not fighting the metal but working with it. "You found your tools," he said. She looked up. "My uncle left quite a collection," she said. "He was a practical man too, it seems." "He was," Roscoe said. He dismounted and tied Pepper to the post that had been sunk outside the door for that purpose, a hitching post that Vernon had put in and that still stood sound. He looked at what she was doing and then at the hinge and then back at what she was doing. "The pin on that style of hinge comes out cleaner if you tap it upward from below," he said. She considered this, reversed her approach, and tried it. The pin came free in 2 strikes. She said. "Your uncle's coffee is still in the tin on the shelf," he said, because he had been in this house once years ago, and he remembered the layout. "I know," she said. "It is old, but it is coffee." "I can have Mabel send some supplies out with Deke," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "you have already let me stay the night, cleared my house of rattlesnakes, and given me an education in Kansas winters. You do not owe me anything. I am not your charity project." "I know that," he said. "Then why are you here?" It was a direct question, and he was a man who gave direct answers, and so the silence that followed was not comfortable because they both knew what it meant. "I was checking my fence," he said. "Was it in poor condition?" she said. "Some of it," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she smiled, just slightly, and turned back to the door frame where she was fitting the new hinge plate she had found in her uncle's toolbox. He stayed for an hour. He did not ask permission, and she did not give it, but she also did not tell him to leave, and they worked in parallel silence, her at the door and him examining the east wall for the crack Deke had mentioned, which turned out to be 2 cracks that needed a serious application of the clay and straw mixture that was the standard chinking material for sod construction. He found what he needed in her uncle's shed, and he mixed it and he pressed it into the cracks while she finished the door. "Your uncle did not have much firewood cut," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I will send Deke with some," he said. "Against the price of the timber in his lot, it is a fair trade." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You are very determined to help me," she said. "I am determined to have a neighbor who makes it through the first winter," he said. "It is purely practical." "Of course it is," she said. And again her voice was warm and not teasing, and it did something to the air in the vicinity of his chest that he had no adequate description for. He rode back to the main ranch and spent the afternoon in such a state of distraction that Deke noticed and said nothing, which in Deke's private language meant he was noticing very loudly. The following week arranged itself around a series of practical exchanges that were practical in the way that two people who are drawn to each other are practical, which is to say they were practical on the surface and something else entirely underneath. He sent Deke with firewood, and she sent back a jar of apple preserves she had brought from Missouri, packed carefully in the carpet bag, which arrived on the Hartwell kitchen table, and which Mabel opened with a little sound of pleasure, and which Roscoe ate on his bread for 4 mornings in a row without commenting on where it had come from. She came through the fence gap 3 days later with a question about the creek crossing and whether it was safe for a wagon in high water, and they stood at the creek bank in the amber October light, and he explained the crossing and the current patterns and the places where the bottom was solid, and she listened the way she always listened, completely and without interruption. "I need to get to Wellington before the month is out," she said. "I need to file some paperwork with the land office regarding the access road issue." "What is the access road issue exactly?" he said. She explained it. Her uncle's 40 was landlocked on 3 sides by Hartwell property. The only road access ran along what was technically a county-designated easement, but Roscoe's fence ran the full length of that easement, and while she could use the gap in the fence by informal agreement, there was no formal legal access established. He was quiet for a moment. He had put that fence there specifically to secure his perimeter, knowing it ran along the easement, knowing it was a gray area legally, and knowing it would discourage whoever came for the Whitaker land from staying. He had not expected whoever came for the Whitaker land to come through the gate anyway. "I will speak to the county surveyor," he said. "I will have the easement formally recognized, and I will open a proper gate in the fence at the road access point. It is the right thing to do." She looked at him. "You put that fence there to discourage access," she said, not accusatory, just accurate. "Yes," he said. "And now you are taking it down," she said. "A section of it," he said. "Yes." "Why?" she said. He looked at the creek. "Because you are going to be here," he said. "And the fence was put up to keep people away who would not stay. It would be wrong to use it against someone who intends to stay." "How do you know I intend to stay?" she said. "Because you came back the second day," he said. "People who are going to run on the first day." She was quiet for a moment. A hawk turned overhead, riding the warm air that came off the open grass. "You are more perceptive than people give you credit for," she said. "People do not give me credit for much," he said. "I think that is because they are afraid of you," she said. "And when people are afraid, they stop looking properly." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the hawk. "Are you afraid of me?" he said. "No," she said. "I was for about 20 seconds when you came at me on that horse." She paused. "Then you took my papers and read them, and a man who takes papers and reads them carefully before he acts is not a man I am afraid of." He did not say anything for a moment. "Come back to the house," he said. "Mabel is making lamb stew, and she will be offended if there are not enough people to eat it." She laughed, and he heard it again, that sound that did something useful and warm to the air. "All right," she said. They walked back together along the creek. Not quite side by side, the gap between them the width of a man keeping himself in check, and the prairie glowed around them in the last of the afternoon light. October moved toward November, and the air got its first real teeth in it, sharp in the mornings, with frost on the grass by the end of the month that crunched under boots, and sparkled in the early light like the land had been dusted with salt. Ellen Whitaker was making the sod house into a home in the determined, methodical way that she appeared to approach everything, and Roscoe was aware of the progress on a level that suggested he was paying closer attention to the Whitaker 40 than his property required. She had a garden plan sketched out for the spring. She had stocked the larder with flour, dried beans, salt pork, and canned goods from Wellington, which she had reached via the newly formalized access road that Roscoe had opened in the fence with a proper gate. She had mended the east wall, oiled the well pump, and acquired a small brown mule named Ferdinand from the liveryman Dobbins, who had warmed to her considerably since her arrival, and who had sold her the mule at what she described as a fair price, and what Dobbins had described to everyone in Wellington as a downright favor. She had also, somewhere in the course of the month, become a fixture at the Hartwell dinner table more evenings than not. This had not been formally arranged. It had simply happened the way things happen when they are driven by something stronger than social convention. She would come to return a borrowed tool or ask a question, and Mabel would be setting the table, and the offer would be extended, and she would accept it, and she would sit across from Roscoe in the lamplight and they would talk. They talked about things that surprised him. He did not talk to people very much and had been content with that. But talking to Ellen was different from talking to anyone he could remember because she talked about ideas, not just events. She talked about what she had read and what she thought about it. She had opinions about the land policy being pushed through Congress, about the Homestead Act and its limitations, about the way the railroad companies had carved up the Plain States and sold off land in a patchwork that left homesteaders and small ranchers fighting over water rights and access in ways that were going to cause trouble for decades. He had these same opinions. He had never said them out loud to anyone because no one had ever asked. The cattle barons are going to run this territory into the ground if the land office does not get serious about enforcement, she said one evening, over Mabel's excellent apple cake, which Mabel had made using the remaining preserves from Ellen's jar. Some would say I am a cattle baron, he said. Some would be wrong, she said. You own 4,000 acres. John Chisholm ran 1,000,000 before anyone thought to stop him. Scale matters. He looked at her. I have been reading about the Lincoln County situation, she said, by way of explanation. The books they had in the Wellington General Store are not extensive, but they were instructive. You read everything in the Wellington General Store, he said. Everything available, she said. I'm a former school teacher. It is a reflex. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have a library. She looked at him. You have a library. 3 shelves in the office, he said. It is not a grand library, but there are books. She said nothing for a moment, and then she said, May I borrow one? You may borrow all of them, he said. She came the following day and spent an hour in his office looking at the 3 shelves with the careful attention of someone evaluating something precious. And he sat at his desk pretending to do accounts and watching her run her fingers along the spines. She picked out a volume on land surveying, a collection of essays by Frederick Law Olmsted on the American South, and a novel that had been Clara's, a copy of Jane Eyre with Clara's name written on the first page in a light hand. Ellen looked at the name on the flyleaf and then looked at him across the office. Your wife, she said. Yes, he said. I will take care of it, she said. I know you will, he said. She took all 3 books back to the sod house, and she returned Olmsted 2 days later with a written list of passages she wanted to discuss, and he sat on his front porch on a cool gray afternoon with the list and the book, and had the distinct experience of looking at marginal notes that someone had made in their mind for his benefit, and it was one of the most intimate things anyone had done for him in years. He wanted to tell her this. He did not know how. The first hard freeze came the 2nd week of November, and the world turned brittle and serious overnight. Roscoe drove his last cattle to the winter pasture, and the hands went about the serious business of making the ranch ready for cold weather, and life contracted to the essentials, which in Roscoe's experience was always when the important things became clear. Ellen came through the gate on a gray Tuesday morning, and he was in the yard when she arrived, and her face was set in a particular way that he had come to recognize as the expression she wore when something was wrong but she was managing it. Ferdinand is sick, she said. I think it might be his lungs. He has a wheeze I do not like, and he did not eat this morning. He went back with her immediately. He was not a veterinarian, but he had been working with animals long enough to know the common ailments, and Ferdinand the brown mule was in the small lean-to shelter she had built against the south wall of the sod house, which was clever. The lean-to doubled as a windbreak. The mule was standing with his head low, and when Roscoe listened at his side, he could hear the wet rattle she had described. "It may be heaves," he said, "or it could be the beginning of pneumonia. Either way, he needs to be warm and dry, and he should not be eating hay right now. Does he have access to fresh water?" "Always," she said. "Good. I will send Deke with some liniment and a recipe for a steam treatment that can help with the lungs, and I will have him bring a load of good straw for the bedding so it is deeper and drier. Straw holds heat better than the grass he has in there." She was watching the mule with the expression of someone who will not allow themselves to be frightened but is. "He is going to be all right," she said. "Most likely," he said. "Mules are tough animals, but he needs attention in the next few days." She nodded. She reached out and laid her hand on Ferdinand's neck and rubbed in slow circles, and the mule pressed slightly into her palm with the trust of an animal that knows its person. Roscoe watched her do this and felt something move in his chest that was not anything he had words for in that moment, and he filed it away the way he filed things he was not ready to address. "I can have one of the hands come check on him in the evenings," he said, "until he is steady." She looked at him. "You keep offering me things," she said. "You keep needing them," he said. "That is not weakness on your part. It is the first winter. Nobody does it alone." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the lean-to, the wind was building and the sky was the color of pewter, and the dry grass bent in long silver waves. "Thank you, Roscoe," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He was not prepared for how much difference it made. "You should come to the house," he said. "The weather is going to turn hard this afternoon, and it is not safe on your own in a sod house in a real storm if something goes wrong." "I am not going to leave Ferdinand," she said. He looked at the mule. He looked at her. He made a decision. "Then I will stay," he said. She blinked. "Until the storm passes," he said. "Mabel knows where I am. The hands know what to do. The ranch will manage for one day." She was quiet for a moment, reading him the way she read things, carefully and entirely. "All right," she said. "I will put the coffee on." The storm hit at 2 in the afternoon, and it hit hard. A curtain of wind and sleet that turned the air white and reduced visibility to 20 feet in any direction. The sod house was warm, though, with the iron stove burning and the thick walls doing their work, and Ellen's lamp threw a circle of amber light that made the small space feel less like a shelter and more like a room. Roscoe sat in the one chair the sod house possessed, and she sat on the trunk she used as a storage bench, with the borrowed copy of Jane Eyre open in her lap, and Ferdinand could be heard shifting and breathing in the lean-to, the wheeze less pronounced now with the warmth and the dry straw. She read aloud, because he had not read it and she offered, and he did not refuse, and she read well with pacing and feeling, and the wind threw itself against the walls outside, and the lamp burned steady, and Roscoe Hartwell, who had not been read to by anyone since Clara died, sat very still and felt the ice he had built up inside himself over 6 years beginning to come apart in the warmth, the way ice always comes apart eventually. She read until the storm began to ease, and then she put the book down and said, "Tell me about Clara." He looked at her. In the lamplight her eyes were very dark and very quiet. "Why?" he said. "Because she was important to you, and she is part of this land, and I would like to know who built the house I eat dinner in every week," she said. "And because I think you have not talked about her in a long time, and I think that is hard on a person." He was quiet for a very long moment. The fire ticked and shifted in the stove. "She was from Tennessee originally," he said. "She came west with her family after the war. I met her in Texas when I was 27 and she was 24. She was the most capable woman I had ever met. She could doctor a sick calf and bake bread and read Greek, and she never once complained about the hard parts." He paused. "She died of typhoid fever in August of 1880. She was 37 years old. She wanted children and we never had them, and she always said it was all right, but I know it was not entirely all right and I could not fix it." He stopped. "I built her the house because she wanted a real house and she got 3 years in it before she died." Ellen was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone who knew what mattered," she said. "She did," he said. "And you have been running that ranch by yourself ever since," she said. "Not because you are fearless, because there was nothing left to fear losing." He looked at her. It was one of the most accurate things anyone had ever said to him, and he had not been expecting it, and it went into him like a key into a lock he had not known had a keyhole. "Yes," he said very quietly. She did not say anything else for a while. She looked at the stove. Outside, the storm was pulling back, the wind dropping to a mutter. "I have not been fearless either," she said. "I came here because I was tired of being safe. I came here because safety without meaning is just another word for stuck. And I knew that if I did not come, if I sold this land for the money and stayed in Springfield, I would spend the rest of my life being sensible and small and very, very sure of exactly how every day would go." She paused. "I am 37 years old, Roscoe, and I have not yet lived anywhere near enough of my life." He heard the number. 37. Clara's age. He felt the strangeness of it, the way life doubled back on itself sometimes, putting the same age in front of you twice but in a completely different form, not to wound you this time but to offer something new. "You will live it here," he said. It was not a question exactly. It was not quite a statement. It was something in between, something tentative from a man who was not tentative about much. She looked at him. In the dying light of the storm, with the lamp burning between them, she had the look of someone who has made a decision but is waiting to make sure it is the right one. "I plan to," she said. He rode home that evening through the clear cold air the storm had left behind. The sky washed blue-black above him and the stars very bright and low, and he felt, for the first time in years, like a man who had something to get up for in the morning. November deepened into December, and the short grass prairie went silver and still under its first dusting of snow. Ellen's mule recovered fully within 2 weeks of the storm, and she was on the 40 acres working every day that weather allowed, clearing the creek bank timber for spring planting, mending the lean-to roof, hauling water from the well in the freezing mornings with her breath coming in white clouds in the air. Roscoe found reasons to ride that direction more days than not. The hands noticed. Hands always notice. His foreman, a sturdy Missouri-born man named Cooper, said nothing directly to Roscoe, but Roscoe came into the barn one morning to find Cooper and Pete, and the two younger hands named Walsh and Greer, in a state of suspended conversation that dissolved very quickly when he entered, and he was not a man who required explanation to understand what was happening. He found Deke alone in the tack room that afternoon. "Do they have an opinion?" he said, without preamble. Deke looked up from the harness he was oiling. "About what, boss?" "About Miss Whitaker," he said. Deke considered his harness for a moment. "General opinion," he said carefully, "seems to be favorable. She's neighborly, she is not full of foolish requests, and she fixed that gate hinge herself, which Pete said he did not see many women do. Walsh thinks she is brave. Cooper thinks—" Deke stopped. "What does Cooper think?" Roscoe said. "Cooper thinks it is good to see you riding out that direction," Deke said. Roscoe looked at him. "He means it kindly," Deke said. "I know what he means," Roscoe said. He picked up a piece of spare leather and looked at it without seeing it. "I don't know what I'm doing, Deke." Deke set down the harness. He had the look of a man choosing his words from a very short, careful list. "Boss," he said, "you have been running this ranch like a man who has already used up his portion. 6 years of going at it hard and never resting and never letting anyone in, and that is fine. That works for a time. But a man can't run on empty forever. It is not natural." He paused. "She is a good woman. She is tough and she is kind, and she does not want anything from you that you have not already offered. And the way you look when you come back from her direction is like the way you looked when he stopped." "When what?" Roscoe said. "When Clara was alive," Deke said quietly. They were both quiet for a moment. "I am not looking to replace her," Roscoe said. Nobody said you were, Deke said. You can love more than one person in a lifetime. That is not replacement. That is just living long enough. Roscoe set the piece of leather down. He walked out of the tack room and into the cold and stood in the yard looking at the sky, and the sky was very pale and very wide, the way it always was over the Kansas plains, as if the land below was simply too big to be covered by anything small. He went to the sod house that afternoon. He had no specific errand. He had a scarf that Mabel had sent for Ellen, because Mabel worried about Ellen's ears in the cold, and that was technically enough of an errand. Ellen was at the woodpile splitting logs with a short-handled axe, which she was doing with a competence that he had stopped being surprised by, because she was competent at most physical things the way she was competent at most other things, from practice and from paying attention. She stopped when she saw him coming and stuck the axe in the splitting block and pulled off her work gloves. He handed her the scarf. She looked at it. It was red wool, Mabel's knitting with a fringe at the ends. Mabel made this, she said. Yes, he said. She worries about me, she said, and her voice was soft. She does, he said. She wrapped the scarf around her neck, and the red against her dark hair and the blue Kansas sky behind her made him think of words he did not usually think in, words that had to do with color and beauty, and the way certain images imprinted themselves on a person without asking permission. Ellen, he said. She looked at him. I would like to court you properly if you will let me, he said. I am not a man who is good at gradual approaches. So I am telling you plainly what my intentions are and asking your permission before I go further. She looked at him for a long, clear moment. The wind moved the grass around them. A crow called somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek. How does Roscoe Hartwell court someone properly, she said, and her voice was steady but her eyes were not quite. Honestly, he said, I don't have any other mode. She reached up and tucked the fringe of the red scarf more firmly against her collar. Then yes, she said, you may court me, Roscoe Hartwell. He breathed out slowly. All right, he said. All right, she said, and she smiled, full and genuine this time, not the small held-back smile she usually allowed herself but the real one, and it changed her face entirely, and he looked at it and understood completely what Deke had meant. December was the courtship of two people who were old enough to know what they were doing and honest enough not to pretend otherwise. He came to the sod house in the evenings and sat by the iron stove, and they read and talked and played at chess on a board she produced from the chess that she had brought from Missouri. He was better at the opening moves. She was better at the end game. They were evenly matched overall, which he found he was grateful for in more ways than just the chess. He brought her to the Hartwell main house for Sunday dinners, and Mabel cooked large and with obvious intention, setting the table with the good dishes and wearing the expression of someone who has been waiting patiently for something and is finally beginning to see it arrive. Roscoe did not rush. He had been a man of restraint for so long that restraint was natural to him, but this was different. This was the restraint of a man who wanted to be careful with something valuable rather than the restraint of a man who simply did not want. He told her she was remarkable one evening in December when she said it without meaning to, in the context of watching her explain, clearly and without condescension, a complicated land law question to Cooper's 15-year-old son who had come to borrow something and stayed talking with her for 20 minutes at the gate. She had looked at him afterward and said, "You are staring. You are good with people," he said, "when you want to be." "I am a teacher," she said, "or I was." "You still are," he said. "You just have a different classroom." She had looked at the open prairie around them, the wide silver-grass expanse of the Flint Hills in the distance and the flat rolling land between, and something moved in her face that was both recognition and happiness together. "I suppose I do," she said. On Christmas Eve he did something he had not done since Clara died, which was to put a candle in the window of the main house, which was a tradition he had kept with Clara every year of their time together. He did it without thinking about it, automatically, the way the body remembers things the mind has tried to put aside. He looked at the candle in the window for a moment and felt the loss of Clara and the presence of Ellen simultaneously, which should have been confusing and was instead simply the true state of things, the way a man can carry grief and hope in the same moment without one canceling the other. Ellen came for Christmas dinner, and after dinner he walked her home across the frost-hard ground under a sky full of stars, and at the gate of her property he stopped. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I have been afraid," he said, "not of the land or the work or the weather, of this, of caring again. And I want you to know that it is not weakness that has made me slow. It is that you are important to me and I did not want to do it wrong." She was quiet for a moment, and then she stepped forward and stood in front of him, close enough that he could see her breath in the cold air. "You are not doing it wrong," she said. He put his hands on her face, gently, the way a man handles something he is not sure he deserves, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back with a warmth and certainty that undid him entirely. And the stars were very bright above the silver Kansas plains, and the candle in his window was visible from where they stood, a small warm light in the dark. They were both laughing slightly when they separated, the helpless quiet laughter of people who have been working towards something and have finally arrived at it. "Merry Christmas, Ellen Whitaker," he said. "Merry Christmas, Roscoe Hartwell," she said. January was the hardest month, the way January always is in southern Kansas, with the temperature dropping hard and the wind coming straight down from Colorado without anything to stop it. But the Hartwell Ranch and the Whitaker 40 both made it through with care and preparation, and the days had their rhythm. The work of the ranch in the mornings, the long, still cold afternoons when the light was low and everything was quiet, the evenings that Ellen and Roscoe moved between their two homes like the land between, was simply a part of the same territory. His hands treated her like a neighbor now, not just a visitor. Cooper's boy started stopping at her place on his way to and from errands, drawn by her willingness to talk about everything from history to cattle grading, and Pete had volunteered twice to help her with heavy lifting without Roscoe asking him to, which Roscoe noted with quiet satisfaction. The feared rancher's gate had become something slightly different now. People still did not come to it without reason, but the sign that said "Turn Back" had been taken down in October when nobody was paying particular attention, or at least when Roscoe had thought nobody was paying attention, and Deke had found it leaning against the back of the barn and had quietly put it in the woodpile. In February, Roscoe rode to Wellington and made 3 visits, to the county land office to finalize the access road formalization for the Whitaker 40, to the Sumner County Bank to discuss some financial business, and to the office of the Reverend Marcus Tolliver of the First Methodist Church of Wellington, Kansas. He sat across from Reverend Tolliver, who was 60 and bearded, and had a look of cautious approval that he was doing his best to suppress. "I need to speak to you about the performance of a marriage," Roscoe said. Tolliver folded his hands. "Your own." "I expect so," Roscoe said. Tolliver asked the necessary questions and Roscoe answered them, and when he rode back to the ranch that evening, he had the date and the logistics arranged, and a marriage license application in his coat pocket, and he felt the particular lightness of a man who has stopped arguing with himself. He found Ellen in his office when he got back, which had become customary. She used the desk when she needed to write letters, and he had given her a key to the house, which had surprised Mabel briefly and then not surprised Mabel at all. She was writing a letter to a former colleague in Springfield, and she looked up when he came in, still in his coat, trail dust on his boots. "How was Wellington?" She said. "Useful," he said. He took off his coat and hung it and went to the desk where she was sitting and stood beside it and looked at her. She read his face the way she read things, carefully and entirely. "What did you do?" she said. "I spoke to a minister," he said. She put down her pen. The fire in the stove ticked quietly. Outside, the February wind moved across the plains with that low, persistent voice it had in winter. "Roscoe," she said. "I know we have not known each other a very long time," he said. 4 months, And I know I am not easy, and I know this land is not easy, and I know you came here to build something of your own, and I have no intention of asking you to give that up. Your 40 acres is yours. Your independence is yours. I'm not asking you to become a smaller version of yourself for my convenience." He paused. "But I want to marry you, Ellen, if you will have me." She stood up from the chair. She was looking at him with an expression that was very full and very still, the way a person looks when they are feeling something too large for their face to contain. "I came here with 40 acres and a broken door hinge and a very frightened mule," she said slowly. "I did not come here expecting you." "No," he said. "I thought you were going to throw me off your land," she said. "I thought about it," he said honestly. "What stopped you?" she said. "You didn't run," he said. "You just stood there with your papers and your backbone, and you waited to see what I was going to do. And I thought anyone that willing to stand their ground on a piece of land they've never seen is someone worth knowing." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, you will, or yes, you're thinking about it." "Yes, I will marry you, Roscoe Hartwell," she said. "Yes, I will." He took her hands in his, those capable, calloused, wonderful hands, and held them. And the fire burned quietly in the stove, and the wind moved outside, and the land was wide and still and full of everything that was yet to happen. They were married on a Saturday in March of 1884 at the First Methodist Church of Wellington, Kansas, on a day that started clear and cold, and warmed through the morning into something almost gentle, with the first green coming up in the grass around the church steps and the smell of mud and early spring in the air. The whole Hartwell Ranch crew came, all 8 of them, with their hair combed and their boots cleaned, standing in the back pews with the slightly self-conscious dignity of working men on a formal occasion. Deke stood at the front with Roscoe, because there was no one else Roscoe would have in that position. And when the Reverend began the ceremony, Deke had the expression of a man who is doing his best not to look moved and failing at it. Mabel sat in the front pew on the bride's side because Ellen had no family at the ceremony, and Mabel wore her good dress and held a handkerchief, and used it from the moment Ellen came up the aisle. Ellen wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had made herself through January and February, staying up late by the lamp in the sod house, with the sound of the winter wind outside, sewing every seam with the same attention she gave everything. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers that Mabel had saved from the previous summer and tied with a ribbon. She walked up the aisle with the same straight-backed, deliberate stride that had carried her through Roscoe's gate in October, and when she reached him at the altar and he looked at her, the expression on his face was one that the people present would later describe in various ways, but all of which amounted to the same thing. It was the look of a man who has found something he did not know he had been looking for, and cannot imagine how he managed without it. The Reverend spoke, and they said their words, and when Roscoe put the ring on Ellen's finger, a plain gold band that he had made in Wellington, his hands were steady, which was something because he had not been entirely sure they would be. There was a wedding dinner at the Hartwell Ranch afterward, which Mabel had organized with the help of the Wellington baker, and an amount of preparation that suggested she had been planning it in her mind for at least a month before anyone had officially asked her to. The table was set for 20, counting the hands and 2 families from neighboring homesteads who had come to know Ellen over the winter and who had been quietly invited, and the food was extraordinary: roast beef and potato bread, and 3 kinds of pie, and a cake with white icing that nobody could identify the origin of until the baker from Wellington produced himself from the kitchen with flour on his apron and was applauded. Cooper made a toast that was short and genuine and ended with, "To the best ranch in Sumner County, and now the best kitchen table in 3 counties, which between the 2 of them I expect is enough for anybody." There was laughter and clinking of glasses, and Roscoe looked down the table at Ellen, who was laughing at something Walsh had just said, her head tipped back, the red of her dress in the lamplight, and he felt with complete conviction that this was the thing, this exactly, the table with people at it, and the lamp burning, and the woman with the laugh he had first heard through a closed office door. Spring came to the Hartwell land in the way it always came to the southern Kansas plains, not gently but with intention, the grass going from silver to gold to green in rapid succession, the creeks running high with snowmelt from the north, the sky filling with the wide-winged hawks and the blackbirds and the meadowlarks whose song was the particular sound of the open country, persistent and clear. Ellen moved into the main house with the practical ease that characterized her approach to most transitions. She did not displace anything of Clara's deliberately. She let things find their natural place in a household that was now genuinely shared. She did ask if she might take down the stopped clock on the mantel and have it repaired, which Roscoe agreed to, and when the clock started running again, it seemed not like an erasure but like a resumption, time moving forward as it was meant to. The Whitaker 40 remained her land. They formalized the boundary in April with a new survey, and she made it clear to Roscoe and to everyone who asked that she intended to use it, which she did, turning the Creekbank timber lot into a small but productive operation, selling cords of firewood to Wellington through the winter months, and beginning in the spring to break ground on the south field for a kitchen garden and small grain plot. She worked alongside the ranch hands without ceremony, not to prove anything but because she understood that the land required everyone. The hands worked alongside her for the same reason and eventually, and without any formal announcement, the Whitaker 40 stopped being thought of as separate from the Hartwell operation. It was just more of what the land needed to be. She had been right about not staying still. Roscoe watched her work and watched her think and watched her with the people who came through the ranch gate, which now stayed unlatched most of the time, and he understood that the sign he had taken down in the fall had been a sign for a version of himself that no longer existed. The feared rancher of 3 counties still existed in name, and the name was still useful because it kept the particular kind of trouble that was looking for easy targets from testing the fences. But inside the name, there was now a man who came home to a lit house, and a woman with opinions about everything, and a table that had people at it most evenings. And that man was, in a way the outside world did not need to fully understand, the more complete version of the person he had always been becoming. By summer there were small signs that the household was going to grow again. Ellen said nothing directly for several weeks, but Mabel knew the morning Mabel knew things, which was to say she knew before anyone had officially confirmed anything, and she quietly rearranged the upstairs sewing room that had been a guest room into something that was clearly being prepared for a different kind of guest. Roscoe noticed the rearrangement and went to Ellen where she was working in the garden in the July heat, and he said, "Mabel has moved the furniture in the sewing room." Ellen kept her hands in the soil, but she smiled without looking up. "Did she?" she said. "Is there something you were going to tell me?" he said. She stood up then and turned to face him, brushing dirt from her hands, and the afternoon light was very bright around her, and she was watching him with that direct gaze of hers, reading his face. "There is," she said, "in the spring, around March." He was quiet for a moment. The meadowlarks were going in the grass around the garden, and the cattle were visible in the middle pasture, and the sky was the deep midday blue of a Kansas July. He stepped forward and took her face in his hands and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and she laughed against him, surprised by the immediacy of it. "You are pleased," she said. "I am," he said, "more than I knew how to say until just now." "Good," she said, "because Mabel is already making plans, and I suspect there is very little either of us can do about it." "Mabel has been making plans since October," he said. "She just now has something specific to plan for." Ellen laughed again and leaned into him slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the garden in the July heat and looked at the land around them, the vast improbable beauty of the short grass prairie in summer, the hawks turning overhead and the grass running gold and green to the horizon. The summer moved through August into September, the days shortening and the air losing its hard heat, the land settling into the golden ease of the early fall that Roscoe had always loved best about this country. It was the season that made sense of everything, the harvest season, the season when the work of the year became visible. He had more cattle than the previous year and better prices, because the rail connection through Wellington had improved, and because Cooper had suggested a change in the grazing rotation that resulted in cattle arriving at market better conditioned. He had the Whitaker 40 timber lot showing a clean profit from the firewood operation, and a grain yield from Ellen's South Field that was modest but real and could be expanded. He had a house that was, by any reasonable measure, alive again. He had, too, a new kind of relationship with the county and the community around them. Ellen's presence changed the way people perceived the Hartwell operation, not because she was charming in a social way, though she could be, but because she was present and engaged and took the community seriously. She attended the Wellington Women's Society meeting in October and came back with information about 3 families who had recently arrived from the East and were struggling in ways that were fixable with modest help. And she said this to Roscoe over dinner, and he listened. And by the following week 2 of those families had work on the Hartwell ranch, and the third had received a load of firewood from the Whitaker 40 at a price they could manage. "You are turning me into a benefactor," he said one evening. "I am not turning you into anything," she said. "I am just telling you what is true. What you do with it is your decision." "You knew what I would do with it," he said. "I knew what the man I married would do with it," she said, "which is not the same as the man everyone in 3 counties is afraid of." "Those are the same man," he said. "In a general sense," she agreed, "but in specifics they diverge considerably." He looked at her. She was knitting by the fire, the red scarf Mabel had made last November long since finished and replaced by something in gray wool that was clearly enormous and was very clearly being knitted to be small. "Who told you about the families?" he said. "Mabel," she said. "Mabel knows everything." "Yes," he said, "she does." "You should pay her more," Ellen said. "I already pay her more than she asked for," he said. "Pay her more again," she said. He did, the following week, and Mabel thanked him without surprise, as if she had been expecting it, which she probably had. October turned 1 year old since Ellen had walked through his gate. He marked the date privately, without ceremony, riding out to the southeast fence line in the morning on Pepper, and looking at the open gate that had replaced the locked section of fence that had been there when she arrived. The latch was simple, easy to open. The road beyond it was clear and well-worn. He sat on Pepper and looked at the gate for a moment. He thought about the man who had put the turn-back sign on the post. That man had been reasonable in his own context. He had lost someone, and the loss had calcified into self-sufficiency taken too far, independence shading into isolation, a life contracted to what he could control and defended against what he could not. He was still that man in some essential ways. He was still hard-edged and brief in speech, and he still got up at 5 in the morning and worked until dark and expected the same from his hands. He was still not someone who enjoyed foolishness or performed warmth he did not feel. But the gate was open. He rode back to the house and found Ellen in the kitchen with Mabel and the smell of bread baking and coffee, and she was telling Mabel something that made Mabel laugh, and when she saw him she said, "Good morning," and the 2 words in her voice had everything in them: the year, the gate, the night of the storm, the chess games, the books, the Christmas kiss under the stars. "Good morning," he said. He poured his coffee and sat at the table, and she sat across from him with her cup, and Mabel went back to her bread. And the October morning was bright and cold outside the windows, and the clock on the mantel was running. In March of 1885, on a cold, clear morning that smelled of early thaw, Ellen gave birth to a son. He arrived with considerable noise and opinion at 4 in the morning, which suited him, because he had 2 parents who were either loud or decisive in their respective ways, and he had apparently decided to be both. The doctor from Wellington had come the day before when it became clear the time was near, and he earned his fee with a calm professionalism that was reassuring, and Mabel was there. and Roscoe was outside the door in the hallway for 3 hours in a state of barely managed composure that Deke later described to Pete as the only time he had ever seen Roscoe Hartwell look genuinely frightened. When the doctor opened the door and told him he could come in, Roscoe went into the room and saw Ellen lying in the bed with the child in her arms, tired and entirely herself, and looked at the small, red-faced creature who was looking back at him with dark, unfocused eyes and an expression of profound dissatisfaction with the world. "He is healthy," the doctor said. "Strong lungs. Mrs. Hartwell is doing very well." "Hello," Roscoe said to the child, in a voice he had never used before, a voice so quiet and careful it was barely audible. "He needs a name," Ellen said. They had discussed names. They had discussed many names over several months of evenings by the fire with the gray knitting growing on Ellen's needles, arguing about it with the specific pleasurable stubbornness of two people who have strong opinions about everything. "James," he said. They had agreed on James, after Ellen's father. "James Vernon Hartwell," she said. Vernon for her uncle, who had left her the 40 acres that had brought her here. "James Vernon Hartwell," he repeated. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she handed him the child with the careful confidence of a woman who knew he would not drop it, and he held the warm, surprisingly solid weight of his son, and felt something move through him that was completely beyond his vocabulary, a feeling so large and quiet and permanent that the only word he had even close to it was home. "He looks like he has something to say," he said. "He gets that from me," Ellen said. "Yes," he said. She smiled and leaned her head back against the pillow and closed her eyes, and he sat very still with the child, and the first light of the March morning came through the windows, and the clock on the mantel struck the hour, and the whole household, and the land around it, settled into the new shape of itself. James Vernon Hartwell grew into a boy who was, as his father had suspected from the first morning, opinionated and loud, and intensely curious about everything within reach of his hands and eyes. He was walking at 11 months. He was pulling himself into saddles by 18 months in ways that made the ranch hands simultaneously horrified and delighted. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and a combination of their temperaments that was, depending on the day, either a marvel or a serious managerial challenge. Roscoe taught him the land as he had been taught the land himself, through touch and observation, and the particular education that comes from being present while the people who know things are doing them, not being told but watching and being invited to try. James watched his father manage the cattle, and watched Deke read the weather, and watched his mother in the kitchen garden, and at the timber lot, and at the desk in the office, writing letters and managing accounts with the brisk competence that characterized everything she did. Ellen continued to run the Whitaker 40 as her own operation, which Roscoe respected, and which James grew up understanding as simply the natural arrangement of his household, that the land had two parts that were separate by deed and together by choice, which was, he would understand later, a fair metaphor for his parents generally. 2 years after James was born, in the spring of 1887, Ellen came to Roscoe in the office one evening while he was reviewing the cattle ledger, and sat down on the corner of the desk in the way she had developed of sitting on the corner of the desk when she wanted to have a conversation rather than a quick exchange. He looked at her. "The South Field is doing well," she said. "It is," he agreed. "I think we could double it," she said. "And if we added a water diversion from the creek, we could make the 40 more productive through dry summers." "We could," he said. She was looking at him with the particular quality of patience that meant she had already thought all the way through something and was waiting to see if he would get there too. "What are you actually proposing?" he said. "I want to put a real house on the 40, she said. "Not for us to live in. A proper farmhouse, 2 rooms for a hired family, someone to work the land continuously and develop the operation. I have been talking to a family in Wellington, the Garcias, father and 2 sons. They have been looking for a situation, and they are experienced farmers, and they need a stable arrangement." He thought about this. The Garcias were one of the families who had arrived from the East the previous year, though in their case they had come originally from the territory of New Mexico, and the father, Manuel Garcia, had a reputation in Wellington for honest work and careful husbandry. "It is a sound plan," he said. "I know it is a sound plan," she said. "I have been working it out for 6 months." "Why did you wait 6 months to tell me?" he said. "Because I was making sure it was genuinely sound and not just an idea," she said. "There is a difference." There was, and she was correct about it. He had married a woman who thought before she spoke, and the years had confirmed that this was one of the best things about her. "Talk to the Garcias," he said. "If the terms work, we will build the house." She kissed him on the cheek, which was her custom when he agreed with her, which Roscoe privately thought was less a reward and more a demonstration of affection that she expressed generally whenever the occasion was positive, but he liked it either way. The Garcia family came to the Whitaker 40 in the summer of 1887, Manuel and his sons Miguel and Thomas, and they built the farmhouse with lumber from Wellington and their own considerable skill, and moved into it before the first frost, and the south field was doubled the following spring, and the water diversion from the creek worked exactly as Ellen had calculated it would. Manuel Garcia turned out to be, among other things, an excellent judge of horses, and Roscoe began consulting him on the ranch stock, and Miguel Garcia, who was 20 and quick-minded, developed under Deke's instruction into a reliable ranch hand who Roscoe eventually hired formally, and Thomas Garcia, who was 18 and had his father's patience, tended the crops with a devotion that made the Whitaker 40 more productive in 3 years than it had been in all the years Vernon Whitaker had worked it. The Hartwell Ranch grew in the way that solid things grow, not spectacularly but durably, building on itself year by year. More cattle, better water management, a reputation in the cattle market at Wichita for quality animals that came from the combination of good land, good management, and the influence of Ellen's insistence on detailed record-keeping, which she had introduced in the first year of their marriage, and which had transformed the ranch's ability to track and improve its own performance. Roscoe did not know, until Ellen made him look at the numbers, how much precision had been missing from his operation. He had been good at ranching by instinct and experience and sheer stubbornness. He became better at it by learning to read what the numbers said. "You are an excellent rancher," she told him one evening in the second year. "I was an excellent rancher before you came," he said, not with defensiveness but with accuracy. "You were," she agreed. "You are a better one now." He thought about this. "So are you," he said. She looked at him. "A better rancher than you would have been alone," he said. "You would have been good on your own, you would have managed, but you are better here with the resource of the larger operation behind the 40 than you would have been with just the 40. She considered this for a moment. "That is fair," she said. "Mutual improvement. Mutual improvement," he agreed. She smiled at him across the table. James was asleep upstairs and the house was quiet and the fire was burning and the clock on the mantel was ticking and outside the southern Kansas night was wide and clear and full of stars. "I am glad I walked through your gate," she said. "I am glad you walked through my gate," he said, "though I was not glad at the time." "I know," she said. "You were very fierce." "I was trying to be," he said. "You were not entirely convincing," she said. "I was entirely convincing," he said. "You said yourself you were frightened for 20 seconds. 20 seconds is not entire," she said. He laughed, which was a thing he did more of now, easily and without managing it, and she laughed too, and the house held them both in the warm lamplight with the particular quality that a home has when it is being genuinely lived in. The years built themselves steadily and well. Roscoe and Ellen had a second child in 1889, a daughter they named Clara Mee, for his first wife, and for the spring of that year, which was one of the most beautiful the plains had seen in memory, with wildflowers from the Texas border to the Nebraska line, and the grass going green so early and so thick that it looked like someone had laid a carpet across the world. Clara Mee arrived in May and was nothing like James in temperament, being quiet and watchful from the beginning, sitting up in her cradle looking at things with dark, serious eyes that reminded everyone who saw her of both her parents in equal measure. She was not loud, and she was not impulsive, but she was, from the time she could pull herself upright, clearly a person of considerable interior life. James adored her with the faintly bewildered devotion of a 4-year-old boy who has been the center of attention, and is adjusting, reasonably well, to sharing it with something very small that he cannot quite figure out. Deke, who had never married and who was now in his late 50s, and had become something between a family member and a permanent fixture of the landscape, took one look at Clara me the first week she was home, and declared her the most composed baby he had seen in 50 years, and then was embarrassed about having said this many times before he managed to stop being embarrassed, which was several months. The ranch continued to grow. The Hartwell brand became known across southern Kansas and into the Indian Territory markets as a mark of quality, and Roscoe began a careful expansion in 1890, purchasing additional acreage to the north that had come available when the Pendleton family gave up their homestead and went back east. And with that purchase, the Hartwell operation became genuinely large in a way that could have been destabilizing to manage without the organizational frameworks Ellen had put in place over the previous years. She was good at large problems. She had a faculty for seeing the whole system of a thing while simultaneously seeing the individual moving parts, which made her invaluable in the expansion discussions, and which also, he had long since understood, was why she had been a very good teacher. She could see where each person was in relation to where they needed to go. She was 37 when she had arrived through his gate, and she was 41 now, and she was in many ways more herself than she had been when she arrived, not because she had changed, but because she had been given the space and resources to become more fully what she already was. He was 45. He had more gray in his hair and less ice in the rest of him, and the men who worked for him would have said, if asked, that he was still not a man you wanted to cross and still not a man who wasted words, but that he was the kind of boss you worked hard for because he was fair, and because working hard alongside him felt like belonging to something real. The county sheriff, a man named Aldrich who had been appointed in '86, told the town barber one Tuesday morning that Roscoe Hartwell was still the most formidable man in 3 counties, but that there was a version of formidable that came from being built on solid ground rather than from being defended against everything, and that the second kind was more useful to a community than the first. He was not wrong. In the fall of 1891, Cooper retired from the foreman position with a pension Roscoe had been setting aside for 3 years without telling him, and Miguel Garcia, who was 24 by then, and who had proven himself in every way a capable and trustworthy ranch hand, was offered the foreman position, and accepted it with the particular combination of gravity and pride that suited him. Deke was 63 and still working, though more in the capacity of a senior advisor than a daily hand, and nobody suggested otherwise because Deke's knowledge of the land and weather and animals was a resource that could not be replaced by hiring someone younger. The Hartwell Ranch moved into the 1890s with the quiet confidence of something built to last. Ellen planted a cottonwood tree in the front yard of the main house in the spring of 1892, a sapling from the creek bank on the Whitaker 40, carrying it across the pasture in a bucket of water with James, who was 7 by now and old enough to help do it properly. "Why here?" he asked her, standing in the spot she had chosen, which was to the left of the porch steps. "Because a tree takes years to grow into what it is meant to be," she said, "and I want us to be here to see it." James considered this with the 7-year-old gravity that was one of his most endearing qualities when he was not busy being loud. "We will be here," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." She planted the tree and she watered it, and it grew, slowly at first and then with the rapid, serious purpose of a cottonwood in good soil, and by the time James was 12 it was tall enough to throw real shade on the porch steps in the summer heat. Roscoe came home one September afternoon in 1894 and found Ellen sitting in one of the porch chairs that had never been sat in when Clara's blue curtains hung in the windows, and the cottonwood was casting its shade across the boards and she was reading, her feet up on the porch railing in a way that was undignified and entirely characteristic. He tied Pepper and walked up and stood looking at her. She looked up. "There is coffee inside," she said. "Mabel made it before she left for her daughters." He got the coffee and came back and sat in the other chair, which had now been sat in many times over the years, and the shade of the cottonwood covered both of them. "Good day." She said. "Good day," he said. "The North herd looked well. I think we are going to have strong market prices this year." "Miguel thinks so too," she said. "He told me this morning." "When did you see Miguel?" "He stopped by to ask about the fence on the 40's north boundary. I told him to go ahead and reset the 2 posts." "Good," he said. They sat in the shade, and the late September light moved through the cottonwood leaves with a gentle sound that was one of the particular sounds of the place and the season, a sound Roscoe had not known he loved until he had someone to sit beside when he heard it. "I had a letter today," she said. "From who?" "A woman in Wichita who heard about the farming operation on the 40, she said. She is thinking about starting something similar on her own land and she wanted advice." "Did you write back?" "I did," she said. 3 pages. He looked at her. She was watching the cottonwood, the sun through the leaves moving on her face. "Are you happy, Ellen?" he said. He did not ask this often, not because he did not want to know, but because he believed you could tell more from watching someone than from asking, and he watched her carefully always. But there were times when asking was the right thing. She turned to look at him. Her face was the face he knew best in the world now, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes from years of sun and laughter, the directness in it that had not changed from the first day, the warmth underneath the directness that had always been there, but that he understood better now than he had. "I am very happy," she said. "I am happier than I thought I was allowed to be when I was standing in Springfield deciding whether to come." "What made you decide to come?" he said. He had never asked this directly. She smiled. "A letter from a county land office and a deed with my name on it," she said. "And the feeling that the alternative was staying exactly where I was for the rest of my life, which was not an alternative I was willing to accept." "Lucky for me," he said. "Lucky for us both," she said. He reached over and took her hand. There in the shade of the cottonwood on the porch of the house he had built for Clara, and that had become, in these years, something new and full and entirely its own. And she laced her fingers through his and they sat in the October afternoon, with the long horizon of the Kansas plains in front of them, visible between the fence posts and the distant dark edge of the timber lot on the Whitaker 40. The land went on as it always did, vast and indifferent to small human concerns, and also, somehow, perfectly suited to holding them. The grass bent in the wind. The hawks turned overhead. Somewhere in the north pasture the cattle were moving slowly in the warm afternoon, living their own quiet, purposeful lives under the wide sky. James came running around the corner of the house then, 8-year-old Clara a few steps behind him, both of them with their boots muddy from the creek, in a way that suggested they had been somewhere they had probably been told not to go. And they came up onto the porch in a rush of noise and argument about some piece of evidence James had found at the creek bank that Clara disputed the significance of. And the porch was suddenly full of voices and mud, and the particular chaotic warmth of children who have been outside all day. Ellen released Roscoe's hand to hold up Clara muddy boot with the expression of a mother, who is not actually angry but is making the point anyway. And James started explaining himself in the overlapping, enthusiastic way he had, gesturing widely, and Roscoe watched all of it with the particular quietness of a man who is holding something very carefully, because it is very good and he knows it. Later, after the children were fed and bathed and read to and put to bed, and after Roscoe had walked the fence line in the long September dusk as he always did and come back to find the house lit from inside against the darkening sky, He came in through the kitchen door and found Ellen at the table with her account books open and a cup of tea at her elbow. He sat down across from her. She looked up. He did not say anything for a moment, just looked at her in the lamplight, in the kitchen of the house that was full now with everything it had been empty of for so long. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She shook her head slightly, but she was smiling. She went back to her accounts. He got his coffee and sat with her in the warm kitchen, and outside the wide Kansas night was settled in its stars, and the clock on the mantel in the next room marked the hours evenly, and the cottonwood stood in the dark yard, growing as cottonwoods do, steadily and deeply and without question, putting its roots down into the good Kansas soil as if it had always been there and always intended to stay. Which was, when you thought about it, more or less the whole story. The gate at the front of the Hartwell property still had no sign on it by 1895. The latch was worn smooth from regular use. People came through it now without much ceremony. The Hands and their families, the Garcias, the occasional Wellington merchant, the new minister who had taken over from Tolliver and who had made it his business to know the significant households of the county. Children from the neighboring homesteads cut across the corner of the property on their way to the county school that had been built 3 miles south, and Ellen had long since made it known that they were welcome to do so, provided they shut the gate behind them. James, at 10, had appointed himself unofficial enforcer of the shut-gate rule, which involved him standing at the gate after school let out on certain afternoons and informing younger children of the rule, with a solemnity that his mother found extremely amusing and his father found, he had to admit, somewhat familiar. "He has your gate manner," Ellen told Roscoe one evening, watching James instruct a 7-year-old from the Pendleton homestead about the proper way to close a latch. "He does not have my gate manner," Roscoe said. "He is standing exactly the way you stand when you want someone to understand something without raising your voice," she said. He watched his son for a moment. He said. "It is a good quality," she said, diplomatically. Clara Mee, meanwhile, had found the 3 shelves of books in the office and had begun working through them in the order she found most interesting, which was not alphabetical or by subject, but by some interior logic all her own, and at 9 years old she was reading Olmsted with the pencil she had found in the desk drawer, making notes in a small journal she kept for the purpose. She and Ellen had long conversations in the evenings about what she read, and Roscoe would sometimes sit in the corner of the parlor with his own reading and listen to the two of them, and feel the particular pleasure of watching something he had had no part in creating, but that was, without question, one of the best things in his house. Deke retired fully in 1896 at 68 years old, with a pension and the old foreman's cabin at the north end of the property, which he shared with a large orange cat he had acquired somewhere and never explained. He still rode out with Roscoe occasionally, on the clear fall days when the grass was golden, and he still talked about cattle and weather with the authority of someone who had been reading both for 50 years. He came to Sunday dinner most weeks and sat at the big table with the family and the Hands who had families, and sometimes the Garcias, and sometimes the minister, and the table was full in the way it had been designed to be, and never used for until Ellen had walked through the gate and changed the terms. One Sunday afternoon in October of 1896, on a day that was precisely 13 years from the day Ellen had walked through the gate, Roscoe and Ellen rode out together to the southeast pasture after dinner, a habit they had formed on Sunday afternoons when the children were occupied and the day allowed it. They rode side by side along the creek bank in the amber October light, and the grass was gold and silver around them, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow with the season. 13 years, she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you remember what you said when you saw me at the gate?" "I said you were on private property," he said. "And I said I was aware," she said. "And I said I did not know you," he said. "And I said you did not need to," she said. They rode in comfortable silence for a moment. "You were frightening," she said. "More frightening than you probably know. But not frightening enough," he said. "Nothing was going to be frightening enough," she said. I had already decided. What had you decided? That I was going to see my land or understand why I couldn't, she said, and that a man on a horse was not a sufficient reason to turn around. He looked at her, riding beside him on the gray mare she had bought the second year, easy in the saddle, the way she had become easy in the saddle through practice and stubbornness. I am glad, he said simply. So am I, she said, every day. The October afternoon was the particular beautiful quiet of the southern Kansas fall, wide and still and full of that particular golden quality that makes everything look like something worth keeping. The hawks were up on the thermals to the south. The cattle were visible in the distance, moving in that slow, purposeful way of contented animals. The Hartwell main house was visible from the rise they rode along, white against the blue sky, with the cottonwood to the left of the porch steps, taller now, fuller, unmistakably part of the place. I want to show you something, Ellen said. She turned her horse toward the Whitaker 40, and he followed her across the familiar ground to the sod house, which still stood, solidly maintained, currently housing the Garcia family's grain stores and some tools, its door with the hinge she had fixed on the second day of her arrival still swinging clean and true. She stopped her horse and looked at the sod house and the lean-to and the well and the woodpile, all of it tidy and purposeful, and beyond it the south field where the winter crop was coming in, managed with the exactness that Manuel Garcia brought to everything he did. When I arrived here, she said, this was 3 rattlesnakes and a broken door and a cracked wall and a sense that I had made a very uncertain decision. You had, he said. I know, she said, but I would make it again. Even knowing what it cost you, he said, the teaching, the people in Missouri, the certainty of a known life. Especially knowing, she said, because the certainty of a known life is not a life, it is an outline of one. He looked at her. 13 years of looking at her and he still found her face the most interesting thing in his considerable landscape. You have made everything better, he said. The ranch, the land, me, he paused. Those are not small things. No, she said, they are not. Neither are you, he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the October light, and then she smiled the real smile, the full one, the one that had undone him the first time he saw it clearly and that had never lost that quality in 13 years. Come on, she said. The children will be looking for us. They rode back together through the open gate, across the land that was theirs together and separately, and in every way that mattered, back to the house with the cottonwood in the yard, and the clock running on the mantel, and the table set for the life they had made in the particular, improbable, entirely logical way that 2 stubborn and serious people find their way to each other, when neither of them is willing to turn back from something worth crossing a fence for. The gate stood open behind them in the October afternoon, easy on its hinge, a simple latch, no sign. It had not needed one for a very long time.